Hello, everyone. Welcome to Hyperspace on Dark Matter Radio. I'm your host, Solaris BlueRaven. I want to thank everybody for tuning in this evening, and a special thank you to webmaster producer Keith Rowland. And my special guest this evening is Dr. John Brandenburg. John Brandenburg, Ph.D., is a plasma physicist. He did his graduate work in California at Lawrence Livermore National Lab and controlled plasmas for fusion power, and has worked in defense, energy, and space research. Dr. Brandenburg was also part of the Clementine Mission to the Moon, which discovered water at the Moon's poles. However, the focus of Brandenburg's scientific career has been to complete the great effort of Einstein to unify the two long-range forces of nature, gravity and electromagnetism. His book, Cosmic Jesus, The Metaphysics of How the God of Israel Became the God of the Cosmos, is available on Amazon.com. And please welcome John to the show this evening. And how are you, Dr. Brandenburg?
Oh, I'm wonderful, Solaris. It's great to be on your show.
Well, thank you for being on the show. It's a pleasure to have you on, and quite the honor. And I'd like to get started and talk about everything that you've been up to for this past year, your current research, and what projects have you been involved in?
Right now, we're preparing for a conference at what's called STAFE 2, Science Applications, Space Technology Applications International Forum in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I'll be chairing the conference. And we're going to be presenting work on Mars, particularly the bottom of a dead civilization on Mars, fusion power, cold fusion, space propulsion, all kinds of cutting-edge stuff.
Awesome.
And unified field theory, of course.
That's right. Was that you?
Yes, and those are the kind of things I've been working on the last year. Particularly Mars has... the data we've been looking at on Mars, Cydonia Mensa, another area called Galaxious Chaos, interestingly enough, that's a NASA name. We did not think up this name. But there apparently, it looks like archaeological formations are there. And we're kind of reaching critical mass there because we have a lot of new data now. Imagine, here's this planet 35 million miles away, depending on the time of the year, and we are examining individual geologic objects on there to try to determine whether they're artificial or not. We're getting multiple pictures of them at high resolution, so it's very exciting.
Excellent. And also, could you do me a favor and just talk a little bit closer to your speaker?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I was a little bit...
much better. Great. Thank you. Yeah, appreciate that.
Okay, very good. So it's been very exciting to work on Mars. One of the problems, however, we're dealing with is that Mars looks like it was the site of a great tragedy. Mm-hmm. We're not sure how deep this tragedy was. It looks as though Mars was a planet like Earth in climate. It had an ocean, apparently abundant life. The reason Mars is red is because its surface is highly oxidized. If you look at pictures of Earth from space, the desert areas of like the American Southwest or the Sahara Desert are bright red. Mm-hmm. That's because the oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere oxidizes the iron in the soil from being a black color, which is called ferrous iron, to ferric iron, which is the same red color in our blood cells. It's called hematite, after, literally bloodstone. So Mars is covered with bloodstone. And this means that there's only one way to generate that much oxygen, and that's by plant life. Mars not only had life on it, it apparently had a biosphere, an evolving, massive biosphere. And then something happened on Mars. And Mars' ability to sustain life collapsed completely, apparently catastrophically. And you had it turned Mars into what it is now, a desert planet, a frozen desert, basically. Mm-hmm. And in the middle of this, we're finding what looks like the remains of a dead civilization that was humanoid. And it looks like it was a primitive civilization. It does not look like it was advanced. Of course, we can't determine its level of technology. And we'll have to land people on Mars with picks and shovels to actually dig through the ruins to actually determine its level of technology. However, our first impression is that it was a primitive, Bronze Age. We're talking ancient Egypt building the pyramids or old Mexico. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is we're finding very interesting parallels between, like the head carved by at Cydonia has certain basic stylistic features very similar to the Olmec heads found in Old Mexico. And these two events appear to be separated by 500 million years. So we find that even though kind of humanoids developed separately, apparently, on different planets, they had similar psychology and ideas of artistic style. It's quite amazing. We'll be publishing more on this later in the year. Right now, in fact, I'm preparing papers to present all of this at the conference. So this is going to be a wide-ranging conference. I'm basically going to take some of our best data and bounce it off like-minded scientists, see what they think. One of the other things we're going to be talking about at the conference is quite separate from any pictures of Mars that look like archaeology in certain areas. We have found evidence in the isotopes of Mars' atmosphere and also patterns of radiation on its surface that Mars apparently experienced a massive nuclear explosion in the past. And this may have been part of what happened to make the planet change from a planet like Earth to a planet like it is now, a desolate wasteland.
Well, that's incredible. So do you think,
know.
Do you suspect, now you said humanoid, so are you saying that you perceive this civilization as being possibly humanoid like us?
Yes. Well, the faces depicted, and other people have found other depictions of faces that are very humanoid and do not look, these are, the big carved face at Cydonia looks very fierce. It's a very fierce face of a humanoid looking up at the sky. We found another face at Galaxis Chaos that looks very similar to it. And they both seem to be men of war, but we found other depictions that are more gentle. So it's very, very strange. We're living in a science fiction movie, apparently. We're just like characters in a science fiction movie, discovering the remains of civilization on Mars, and it's like I've seen this movie before.
Right, it certainly seems that way. Yeah.
And but then we're also finding since we're finding what looks like a primitive civilization, then evidence for one and perhaps two massive nuclear explosions. We're talking hydrogen bombs as big as the Empire State Building dropped from space. Wow.
And what timeline are you looking at for that?
It apparently happened during or shortly there or after Mars' climate collapsed. It's like a detective story. I believe in the next couple of years, the human race is suddenly going to wake up one morning and realize there's a dead body in their backyard with multiple stab wounds. And they're going to realize not only are they not alone in the universe, this may be a dangerous neighborhood.
Wow, that's incredible.
And it's mind-boggling, and because the civilization appears primitive and yet apparently nuclear weapons were employed against it, it's looking like you're ending up coming face to face with cosmic evil. Not just at first it looked like Mars got hit with a big asteroid. And that's death by natural causes. Mars is next to the asteroid belt. It's a bad place to have a planet with a civilization on it. But then, as we dug deeper and we found these isotopic signatures matching nuclear weapon tests on Earth, then we began to recognize that no, this was not death by natural causes. This apparently, well, we're not sure yet, but it's possible we're looking at deliberate planetary scale genocide.
Wow, that's really big. And I'm wondering, is there any other way to perceive those isotopes, like perhaps it was just a natural occurrence, or does it match the signature of a hydrogen bomb being dropped from space?
At first, the first impression was, gee, this looks like a large nuclear weapon. And then we looked into the possibility that it was a natural nuclear reactor. Apparently on Earth, there were natural nuclear reactors that got started in some very rich uranium deposits about 1 billion years ago. Nature did its own little experiment with nuclear power. And we thought that perhaps on Mars there was just a very big one, and it went unstable and exploded. But we found out by looking very carefully at the isotopes, particularly the xenon, no, this is not consistent with that. It is a hydrogen bomb signature.
Wow, that's pretty heavy.
It is, and it basically provoked a lot of soul searching in me and others, and we reported it to the Pentagon as soon as we found out this possibility existed, and they got back to us in about 6 months, and basically, typical of intelligence people, their answer was a question. Why don't you publish? And so we took that as a go ahead and publish. So we did. We started publishing this. By that time, we thought maybe this is a natural nuclear reactor, and that just went unstable and blew up. But no, the best interpretation we can make now is that this was apparently a thermonuclear device. Most people, I went to school at Lawrence Livermore National Lab where they design hydrogen bombs, and as a graduate student there for 6.5 years, I got an informal education in nuclear weapons and how they operate, and I'm not talking about anything that's classified, by the way. All of this is open source, what they call open literature. But most people do not understand that a hydrogen bomb, a modern hydrogen bomb, is wrapped in uranium or thorium, and the intense neutrons from the hydrogen reaction, which have very high energy, much higher than produced like in a fission reactor, those very high energy neutrons then split even ordinary uranium and thorium, so that about half of the energy from a modern hydrogen bomb comes from fission. And this is what produces the xenon isotope spectrum that then appears in the Earth's atmosphere, is particularly peaked at xenon 129. And you can look this up in books. If you look up xenon isotopes in Earth's atmosphere before and after nuclear testing, you can see the spike at xenon 129 appeared because of the U.S., the Russians, the French, the Chinese, all setting off very large hydrogen bombs wrapped in uranium. So this secret on Mars kind of led back to kind of some grim little facts that are not well known on Earth about what we were doing to our own atmosphere during this nuclear testing period of the Cold War. But one of the reactions that I had, since I'm religious, I'm an Episcopalian. I can tell Episcopalians, they don't have prayer meetings, they have committee meetings. But I am religious, and I basically decided that if I'm confronting this much cosmic evil, at least it's a possibility, I should start meditating on cosmic good pretty soon, or I'm going to become a very unhappy person.
Right.
So I began an investigation of cosmic good. What does the Bible say about, God is the God of the cosmos? And I ended up writing this book. I wrote a book called Life and Death on Mars, where I discussed the catastrophic end of Mars. And then I ended up, so I published that. and it got kind of the basic data and ideas out. There we were talking about natural nuclear reactors. Mm-hmm. But I ended up writing the book Cosmic Jesus, and it takes its title from the fact that in the ancient Greek, which is what the New Testament is written, the word for world, as in Jesus died for the sins of the world, or for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that word in the ancient Greek is the word cosmos. And that word means exactly in the Bible, in ancient times, the word cosmos meant the entire universe, the stars, the planets, everything. And most people do not realize that 200 years before Christ, there was a fellow named Aristarchus of Samos who basically achieved a modern understanding of cosmology. He figured out the Earth orbited the sun, the Earth was a round sphere, the planets were other spheres, the moon orbited the Earth. He basically figured out that the stars were other suns with planets around them. He got the entire solar system figured out. He even figured out the relative sizes, the sun, the moon, and the Earth. And all of this was known to philosophers 200 years before Christ, and particularly the Apostle Paul was very aware of it because he received a classical Greek education. He was an educated Greek philosopher as well as a rabbi, and so he then went to rabbinical school. When Jesus tells his disciples, go out into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, that word again, if you look at it, what is it in the original Greek manuscript? It's the word cosmos. Mm-hmm. So by implication, God is telling us that there are other people out in the stars. Mm-hmm. And you must go and preach the gospel to them too. The gospel must be preached to the Klingons.
Kapla, right?
We're speaking of, so this is in the Bible. So I decided to, I was at one point a fundamentalist. My family left the Presbyterian church where I grew up and decided to become evangelical fundamentalists, in fact, charismatic fundamentalists. And I remember hearing from the pulpit that there was no extraterrestrial life. And so I eventually studied the Bible in ancient Greek. I mean, you can get Greek texts and look up every word. That's one thing is called a Strong's Concordance. It has every word in the Bible. Mm-hmm. And then it's English, it's English rendering, and then you look up what is the Greek word that is translated as, in this case, the word world. And the Greeks had a word for the earth, G. They understood from Aristotle that the earth was round, a round sphere, because they were expert geometers, and they looked at the circular shadow of the earth during lunar eclipses, just like the one we had last night. And they could see that there was a round bite out of the moon, and they realized, okay, that means the earth has come between the sun and the moon, and the earth is round. And just like the sun and the moon, and the Greeks were very pleased because they considered round things to be perfect. Mm-hmm. So these things were well understood by the ancients 200 years before Jesus. The Ptolemaic idea that the earth is the center of the universe was actually only formulated after Jesus. And one of the reasons it was formulated is because, for instance, when Alexander the Great was told that Earth was not the center of the universe and there were also many planets like Earth, he wept and said, "You've told me there are many worlds, and I can't even conquer this one." So the powers that be have never been particularly pleased by the idea that they're not... Their powers are limited to this planet, and it's just a speck of dust. When you talk to them about other planets and life on them, that they view that as demotion. Mm-hmm. So, but during the very free period of Greek and Roman thought, people reconciled the idea that they were not the center of the universe with being still worthwhile, and they were able to live with that. And it was only later, when things became much more authoritarian again, that in order to please the authorities, you told them that they were lords not only of the earth, but the center of the universe. Mm-hmm. In fact, I joke with my students, I joke that in a previous life I was chief astrologer to Pharaoh Ramses in ancient Egypt, and Pharaoh Ramses asked me one day, I tell my astronomy class this joke, that Pharaoh Ramses asked me, "Oh, John of Brandenburg, what lies at the center of the universe?" And my immediate answer is, "Why, it's you, Pharaoh." Great Pharaoh Ramses, you are the center of the universe. And I receive a promotion because he was very pleased by this answer.
Yeah.
So,
mirror.
But in the meantime, the time before Jesus, 200 years before Jesus, this understanding of the cosmos was well known, and Paul would have certainly been taught this. So the mission of Christ in the Bible, in the Greek, and the mission of the church that he gave him this great commission is cosmic and not terrestrial. So the mission of Christ was to take away the sins of the whole cosmos, not just Earth and its people, but the whole thing. And the mission of the church is cosmic, and this is very much amplified by Paul himself. I was drawn to meditate on this because of, finding that, we may encounter evil at of a astronomical scale, not just a little bit of evil, a whole bunch. We may be face to face with it in the next decade as we go up to Mars and discover what happened there.
Mm-hmm. That's really fascinating to me. And what's very interesting is why the Pentagon doesn't seem more concerned. I mean, sounds like they were just kind of nulling it out.
Sometimes, I can actually say that the government snooped on us a lot when we were investigating Mars. Our phones would act funny. In fact, at one point, myself and I was working closely with another researcher in another state when I was living in Washington, D.C., working incidentally on Star Wars. But as I was constantly on the phone, long distance with this fellow, back in the old days, they charged for long distance. Mm-hmm. And the phone would act funny. It would sound like we were in an echo chamber. You hear tapping noises on the phone. And especially, I just mentioned the word Mars, and suddenly there would be this click, like a recorder was starting, had just been connected. And finally, the ultimate absurdity happened. My long-distance calls to this fellow, Vince DiPietro, quit appearing on my phone bill. I showed him a copy of the bill, and I said, "Vince, we have our own very own long-distance company now."
Oh, wow.
And so we would, and because we were both very, very patriotic, we were saying, we're just doing this. We would make long speeches on the phone. We would say, well, we're doing this because we don't want the Russians to get to Mars first and find perhaps new technology buried in ruins on Mars. And, we want America to get to Mars first and discover whatever it is first. And, we must have bored a lot of these people to tears listening to all these tapes. But at no time did all anyone had to do was come up and tap me on the shoulder and say, Dr. Brandenburg, we really wish you would not poke around on Mars anymore. Mm-hmm. Because I effectively worked for the government. I was a government contractor.
Right.
They would have said, the Mars thing is compartmentalized, top secret. You can't work on it anymore. And that's all they would have had to do. Mm-hmm. And I would have obeyed. And they never did that. As a matter of fact, they seemed very interested and at times almost encouraging us to continue our research. I think the U.S. government, it can be said, has single-mindedly pursued the truth about Mars in a kind of passive way by finding all this data and then dumping it in the public view for people like us to find. We also found out that Carl Sagan, Carl Sagan was a truly great scientist. His first claim to fame was finding the greenhouse effect on Venus. He predicted that Venus would be very hot. And we also discovered that he probably figured out before anyone that Mars had a climate collapse. And because when we started researching it, guess who had already figured it all out? It was Carl Sagan and his colleagues. And so I can say that the government maybe has not been in a big rush for things out Mars to come out, but the U.S. government seems to have actually wanted this stuff to come out. I remember it was NASA that announced they found life on Mars in Mars past. The only people who seem to have engaged in any misappropriation of data or mishandling data, attempted cover-up of data, is some of the institutions, Jet Propulsion Lab and its main contractor, Malin Space Science Systems. They have certainly attempted to obstruct this investigation, and they're doing it at taxpayers' expense. However, the U.S., in fact, at one point there was a power struggle between NASA, Dan Golden, and Jet Propulsion Lab over whether to take pictures of the new pictures of the face of Cydonia, and Dan Golden basically ordered JPL, you will take those pictures and you will release them. And then when they took the first picture, we in fact analyzed the picture, found out that yes, it confirmed it was artificial, despite what you heard in the news. They released basically a photoshopped picture that made it look like a footprint in a snowbank. And everybody remembers that. And in fact, when we got it and enhanced it, just using standard techniques, it shows there's nostrils in the nose and ornaments on the helmet. And so Malin Space Science Systems basically completely bamboozled the press on that. We reported the enhancement of the picture at the next scientific conference that we could attend, and one of the people from Jet Propulsion Lab showed up and flew into a rage and tried to punch Vince DiPietro in the nose.
Wow.
Well, I mean, I stopped him, and I interposed myself between Vince and this fellow, but this guy completely lost it. And if anything convinced me that he was saying the same things we were seeing in the pictures, it was I knew even if his mind couldn't accept it, he saw that this thing was artificial, and he was screaming at us, "Are you calling me a liar?" Wow. Sir, we haven't said anything about you. And he came to our paper. We didn't go looking for him. He came to our paper and had this outburst. Vince DiPietro. Holy cow! Oh, it was surreal. And Vince was mad at me. He says, "John, you should have let him hit me. Then I could sue him."
Right.
But I decided, this is better. Vince might have lost his temper. The guy was a little skinny, old, gray-bearded professor, and anyway, it was like a scene from a movie.
Oh my goodness.
And it was quite dramatic, and it convinced me that, okay, we win the argument. The guy tries to throw a punch. The old Chinese saying from Confucius is, the man who throws the first punch loses the argument.
Yep.
And but we were able to do. Then what happens? Dan Golden ordered the Jet Propulsion Lab had to keep taking pictures and releasing them, which they have. And so we have a fine set of pictures, both from the Mars probes run by JPL, and then another group of pictures by Arizona State University, which runs its own probe called Odyssey. And they've taken just magnificent pictures. So we have an enormous data set on Cydonia, and also on this other site called Galaxious Chaos. It's at the edge of what's called the Utopia plane, and so we're like a bunch of pirates with big chests of treasure.
Nice.
That we've dug up. We're very pleased.
Well, let me ask you something about the photos. Now, I've understood that the photos have to be approved by intelligence areas before they can be distributed to any type of mainstream or even the scientists. Is that true or no?
I don't know that to be a fact, but I would be surprised if the intelligence people didn't go over the pictures.
That's what I'm wondering, if they omit certain artifacts or things that are questionable and they just distribute what's generic.
Well, one of the I'll tell you something. Because of a lot of what we do at Mars, the shadow cast over it is from Percival Lowell back in the early 1900s. And the early 20th century, he had found that, Mars looked like a desert planet, and he thought he saw canals there, signs of intelligent life. And even though that view of Mars got eroded as telescopes got better, the U.S. government expected to find archaeology on Mars. Von Braun even said so. He said that some of the earliest astronauts to go to Mars should be archaeologists. And so it was the expectation, kind of at the gut level in the U.S. government, that Mars would probably have a dead civilization on it. It looked like a planet that had been like Earth and then dried up and become a desert, just like Percival. That was Percival Lowell's. He said there used to be oceans on Mars. The first person to say there were former oceans on Mars was not me. Even though I gave the first scientific paper on it in a scientific forum at a conference called the MECA conference, MECA, was Mars, Evolution of Its Climate and Atmosphere in 1986. And people don't give me credit because I'm part of the Cydonia investigation. So, but the first person to propose dead paleo oceans on Mars was Percival Lowell. So the U.S. government, in its investigations of Mars, I think, thoroughly expected to find archaeology. They didn't find it immediately, but they did find when one of the people who used to work at Jet Propulsion Lab named, I've forgotten his name. I don't want him to get in trouble. But he told me that the Mariner 9, which was the first spacecraft to orbit Mars and photograph at large areas at close range with good cameras, as soon as that got within 2 weeks of orbiting Mars, armed guards appeared at the photo labs.
Wow.
And he said this was back in 1969, 1970, and the reason was they were afraid of terrorists. Even in those days, they used the word terrorist. And so, but he was aware that the scuttlebutt, there's the official story, and then there's the background. What do people say this is really about? He said the understanding at the lab was that they were afraid they're going to find archaeology on Mars in these close-up pictures, and they wanted to make sure that none of those pictures got out unless the government wanted them to. And finally, just when the Viking, the next probes, were going to come to Mars in 1976, they released pictures of what they called the Pyramids of Elysium. And those are discussed in Carl Sagan's book, Cosmos.
Mm-hmm.
And he even discusses the idea that they may be the remains of a civilization.
Mm-hmm.
He said they should be investigated. And this is Carl Sagan in his book Cosmos goes out of his way to say there's no life on Mars.
Mm-hmm.
And then he throws onto the page of the Pyramids of Elysium. So that was probably the first sign of what looked like archaeology on Mars that they'd released.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the face on Mars got released apparently by accident.
Oh, by the way.
Oh, yes. Apparently, someone told Vince DiPietro, who worked at NASA, he said, that was a big screw-up. That wasn't supposed to happen. And but it happened. And, of course, then Vince DiPietro and Greg Pulmonar found a second picture. And, by the way, there are two pictures of the face of the Pyramids of Elysium. Mm-hmm. They only published one, but they actually brought the spacecraft back, which was extremely difficult, and took another picture of them. Mm. And, they look like pyramids in the second picture, too. So they basically established here it looks like eroded-looking pyramids on Mars. So what happened then was the face on Mars got released in Cydonia, and Cydonia was supposed to be the primary landing site for the second Mars lander, mm-hmm. The Viking 2, and they decided to move the landing site. And apparently there was a big academic scuffle over moving the landing site, and some people were mad. There were there were some angry shouting matches at some meetings over moving the landing site from Cydonia. And then the face on Mars apparently got released because somebody was mad at somebody else and wanted to release the picture just to make to stir things up and make some other people look bad. And so it was one of these squabbles, apparently, behind the scenes that resulted in this picture, which otherwise probably wouldn't have been released. But somebody was trying to get back at somebody and embarrass them, so they released the picture anyway. So it created a firestorm. And
thank goodness for that.
And and of course, Jet Propulsion Lab that was in charge of they immediately started lying. They said, we took a picture an hour later and the face was gone. Well, as it turns out, they had taken the picture at sunset to have maximum shadows. Mm-hmm. And so any picture taken an hour later would have shown only darkness. And so what happened is they waited for 30 days and brought the spacecraft back over Cydonia and took another picture. Hmm. And DiPietro and Molinar found it. But it's interesting is the U.S. government as a whole, I can say clearly, has rather single-mindedly pursued knowledge about Mars and making that public. Mm-hmm. At no time have they ever... I'm not aware of anyone else who was tapped on the shoulder, told to quit working on this stuff. We've actually been kind of almost quietly encouraged to do this. It's like the U.S. government wants this stuff out, but doesn't want its own fingerprints on it. It wants this to be this is very different from like the UFO thing. Mm-hmm. For one thing, a dead civilization on Mars is not threatening directly to people on Earth. It doesn't cause there's no problem. People are not going to panic over finding pyramids and a big car faces on Mars that are dead. Mm-hmm. It looks like a dead primitive civilization. In fact, I told NASA people, we were down at NASA headquarters at one point, there's a group of us called the Society for Planetary SETI Research, called SPSR, very fine organization. It's international. And it's all of us, a lot of us are going to be in Albuquerque presenting papers. And we actually met, the SPSR kind of leadership met with NASA just before they took the picture of the Cydonia. And I, in my little brief talk, said that, finding a dead civilization on Mars is the ultimate soft landing for the human race.
Mm-hmm.
You find that you're not alone in the universe. There's other intelligent life, but it's completely non-threatening. It's dead. In fact, it looks primitive. It doesn't look like they ever could have been a threat to Earth. And so that is it is a soft landing for the human race. If you're going to break bad news to somebody,
mm-hmm.
this is the way to do it.
That's interesting.
It is. And so as I said, the U.S. government, and particularly NASA's leadership under Daniel Golden, mm-hmm. I believe is kind of their Uncle Sammy and Dan Golden in particular are kind of heroes in my book, because they have gone out to take all of this data and they've made it available to the public. And even the people who have apparently tried to cover this up have been afraid to not release the raw data. Mm-hmm. So the raw data has come out. It's U.S. government property, and it's like, by the way, why would anyone at Jet Propulsion Lab not want us to find a dead civilization on Mars? Mm-hmm. It's because if there's a dead civilization on Mars, they're not afraid of that. They're afraid of Johnson. And Johnson is not a who, it's a what. It's mm-hmm. Johnson Space Flight Center. One of the people who work at Jet Propulsion Lab told me that he'd had a discussion with management once. The manager, one of the big heads of the lab, had told him, "We know if we find anything exciting on Mars, the astronauts will come," this is a direct quote, "with their big rockets mm-hmm. and take Mars away from us." Oh,
territories.
So this is literally the cover-up forces. This is not a government cover-up. This is it's nothing so noble. This is almost a petty little squabble about big institutional science and its budgets and its agendas. Mm-hmm. You have institutional agendas, and you think, why wouldn't they want to find a dead civilization on Mars? Mm-hmm. Wouldn't that be good for them? No.
Jeez.
Not the way they not in their using their accounting methods. Mm-hmm. They will lose the planet Mars. They will lose control of it to Johnson Space Flight Center in Texas. A terrible place.
So bizarre. Well, what about?
It is. It's almost. There's almost a comic aspect to this.
Yeah. What about foreign countries, though? I mean, look at the other countries. I mean, why are they so concerned about competition within the United States?
I know. We as soon as we published our first papers on this, we went to a scientific conference and published what we'd found on Mars. Mm-hmm. What was called the Independent Mars Investigation Team, IMIT, and this was organized by Richard Hoagland, who did a really good job. I mean, he's more of a journalist than a scientist, but he's brilliant, and he organized our little investigation, and we charged up to this conference and presented our papers, and in fact, that was the first place where the Mars ocean was presented. Mm-hmm. Within that conference paper, and Mars has never been the same since. And what happened then was the Russians apparently had eyes and ears at the conference and immediately published in one of their propaganda sheets their own discussion of a dead civilization on Mars. Mm. A Russian had investigated it named Vladimir Avinsky. And so the Russians were very aware of it. They wanted us to know they were aware of it. So we immediately became sucked into a kind of international swirl of international intrigue. Mm-hmm. We began having our scientific meetings, meetings at International House of Pancakes, so that foreign spies would feel welcome and I'm just kidding. Like I said, there's a kind of comic aspect of this.
It's cloak and dagger sometimes. Sure.
Oh well, like Washington D.C., the space community is kind of a small town, and so the same people show up at the conferences. So you were down at one of these. It's Vince DiPietro and I, and there's a fellow, an astronomer at a community college named Larry, who is very avidly interested in our investigation, and he's very smart. I mean, he's got a lot of insights that are very helpful. And so he had joined us at this conference. We're standing there out in the hall, and we're about to meet Carl Sagan, who's at the conference. And Carl Sagan and I had several conversations about this, and he talked for a long time with Vince DiPietro at one of these conferences. Anyway, we're waiting to meet Sagan. We're standing in the hall. Air Force colonel walks up, and here's this Air Force full-bird colonel, as they say, wearing dress uniform and scrambled eggs on his hat, and he introduces himself to Vince DiPietro and tells him, Vince, you're doing a good job. Please keep up the good work. And then Vince introduced him to me. And then the colonel turns to this guy, Larry, who's standing there, and says, hi, Larry, how are things at the DIA, which is the Defense Intelligence Agency? And Larry is a real pro. He doesn't even bat an eyelash. He just says, they're fine, Colonel. Thanks for asking.
Wow.
And DiPietro was just horrified because he thought that this guy was just a astronomy professor. But I quietly motioned with my hand to Vince not to be upset. Don't say anything. And Larry kind of looked a little awkward and excused himself after that, and we didn't see him for the rest of the day. And so apparently this is rivalry between Air Force intelligence and Defense Intelligence Agencies. Different agencies was constantly squabbling. They're very competitive, and CIA, DIA, NSA, etc. They would all show up in meetings, and so and I just told Vince, I said, Vince, we thought this stuff we were doing was important. Apparently some other people think it's important too. And by that time we'd pretty much known that our phones were being tapped, but as I said, no one ever told us to stop or cease and desist. That's all they had to do. And I have a good friend who was in the Naval Intelligence, particularly Naval Space Command. And I would always tell him about the stuff we were finding, and he just ate it all up. And if there was anybody who, over a few beers, I spent many a pleasant evening, at his house in Virginia countryside, having a beer on the front porch. All he would have had to say is, John, we've known each other since we were 11 years old. You better knock off this Mars stuff. That's all he would have had to say.
Right.
And I would have immediately done that, but no, quite the opposite. He said, this is really interesting stuff. John, I'm so glad you're investigating it.
Very encouraging. Well, maybe they're not authorized to stop you. Well,
I think maybe there was Solaris, that is actually a very good suggestion. When you get into what is called compartmentalized secret programs that are above top secret, people only know what they need to know to do their jobs. And one of the things that this does is it decentralizes everything. So it may have simply been that no one was in charge, which is actually a lot easier to imagine. After working in Washington, D.C. for 15 years, it's very easy to imagine that nobody knew who was actually in charge. And so, therefore, no one had the authorization to tell anybody to quit investigating. So they just decided to just let us investigate.
Keystone Cops, right?
Well, a little. There was a little bit of an aspect of that, especially when you get an Air Force colonel blowing the cover of somebody from DIA who's trying to investigate, kind of a gumshoe way.
Mm-hmm.
And so, one of the funny things, my interest in ufology, UFOs turned into, I decided to pursue that as science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went to a lot of UFO conventions, basically assembling data for my big science fiction novel about it. It's called Morningstar Path, The Collapse of the UFO Cover-Up. And one of the things I noticed was that a lot of people, especially if there were conferences in the Washington, D.C. area, it seemed like half the people who were there were from intelligence agencies. I even recognized some of them.
That's funny.
And of course, I would just pretend not to notice them. And so it was almost a Keystone Cops kind of atmosphere sometimes. And
mm-hmm.
but at the same time, the people who would have realized that there was signs of a big nuclear explosion on Mars from 1976 was the U.S. government.
Mm-hmm. Right.
However, that data was all published, and so this has been a situation where the U.S. government has had cards that isn't showing,
mm-hmm.
but has not prevented anyone from investigating. And the only people who seem to have actively tried to mislead the public or cover things up was not the U.S. government, but rather much smaller and pettier academic actors,
mm-hmm.
For whom finding a dead civilization on Mars was viewed as a disaster.
That's interesting.
And it'll wreck everything we have planned. Mars is worth a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
I used to actually write an equation on the board for some people, and it was a $ sign and equals the male symbol, which is the symbol for Mars.
Mm-hmm.
So I said Mars equals money, and nowhere was that more apparent in the Clementine mission.
Mm-hmm.
We went to the moon. Ostensibly to test all of this new technology we developed under the Reagan Star Wars program.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, did that stuff work well. It looked like it had already been thoroughly tested someplace else.
Mm-hmm.
Supposedly our mission was to test everything. Now, you could say, oh, well, they were just doing that to show everybody how well this stuff worked in space. Well, we went and looking back on it, it looks like we were doing a military reconnaissance mission to the moon,
mm-hmm.
Looking for maybe somebody else is up there and has built stuff, and we want to know what they have built since Apollo.
Mm-hmm.
Since we orbited the planet during Apollo and the moon during Apollo, and took pictures of everything that would be interesting. We're sending another probe up there after it's 20 years after Apollo,
mm-hmm.
and we want to see. Have they enlarged anything? Have they abandoned anything, et cetera, et cetera? We're looking for changes since Apollo. And, but of course, we were kind of aware of that possibility, but when you're working for the Department of Defense, you keep your mouth shut.
Mm-hmm.
It's shut your mouth and earn your gold.
So what'd you find out? No, I'm kidding.
Well, we didn't. I didn't get to see most of the pictures. I probably saw one picture out of 100.
Mm-hmm.
All of the pictures on that mission were processed by a contractor that occupied the upper corner of the building, upper corner of the building, mm-hmm. and no one else was allowed in there unless they had business there.
Mm-hmm.
And this was being run by the military.
Yeah.
This was a military mission to the moon. We had some NASA people riding along because we were looking at interesting things that looked like volcanoes and various other interesting science goals we wanted to investigate, and so we. But almost all of the pictures they took millions of pictures, and we probably saw less than 1 in 1,000.
Oh, bummer.
And they would come through the big mission control. They were what are called housekeeping pictures. Mm-hmm. We had like 4 different cameras. Like we had deep infrared, near infrared, which is almost visible light, and then we had visible light, ultraviolet, and we had all these cameras snapping away, taking pictures, and so nothing could hide. Mm-hmm. If you had camouflage that worked invisible, it would show the ultraviolet sensors would pick up something beneath it, or in infrared, we were looking for thermal, any hot spots on the moon, mm-hmm. Such as, a base.
Yes.
On the night side of the moon, on the dark side of the moon, anything that's putting out heat will stick out like a sore thumb. Mm-hmm. And so we looked for all, so that, you can say that the Defense Department has been doing its job. And so the probe they have orbiting the moon now is called the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, mm-hmm. LRO. They have a similar probe orbiting Mars called the MRO, Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. And the joke in Washington, D.C. is that anything that rhymes with NRO, like MRO or LRO, mm-hmm. is run by the National Reconnaissance Office, which runs all of the top-secret military satellites. Mm-hmm. All of the stuff we're watching in Ukraine going on now is being run by the NRO. Mm-hmm. So they are effectively running 2 military spy satellites, one at the moon, one at Mars, and they have both moon and Mars under surveillance, military surveillance. Right. And this is being done in plain sight of the public. I don't know where all the pictures are going, but they're being analyzed by somebody, and it just means that somebody is doing their job. Mm-hmm. We live in a new age, and yes, you should be concerned if somebody builds a big dome on the far side of the moon, mm-hmm. and it's not you, it's not us, it's not the Chinese, it's not the French, it's not the Russians, it's somebody else, and you want to know about that.
Right. That's really fascinating.
Oh, well, we live
like that job.
We're not... in my novel, Morning Star Pass, The Collapse of the UFO Cover-Up, when the cover-up collapses, like Watergate, mm-hmm. in the Senate hearing room, and also because a bunch of ranchers shoot down a UFO on their land, mm-hmm. is trying to mutilate some of their cattle. And I had this one scene where just as the crisis has broken open in Washington, D.C., you have national security advisors being grilled in the Senate hearing room, and denying everything. There are no aliens. There is no alien treaty.
Yeah, where'd you get this idea?
Yeah, well, I studied the John Lear secret history, mm-hmm. and actually sat down and had a long chat with John Lear, who worked closely with the CIA, as it turns out, in his previous career. Mm-hmm. So his father worked closely with the U.S. military and intelligence services. So he kind of deduced the secret history of U.S. government's. People ask me, what do I think of John Lear's secret history and the whole UFO cover-up? And I say, I think it would make the substance of an excellent novel. Mm-hmm. So that's what I did. I wrote a science fiction novel under a pen name Victor Norgard. Okay. But anyway, I have this scene where a bunch of cowboys are now guarding this shot-down saucer. There's a half-mutilated cow. There's a bunch of dead little gray aliens. There's that one dead human in a black uniform. And so this is all being guarded then by a bunch of ranchers toting high-powered rifles. And another cowboy rides up, gets off his horse, looks at this whole scene, and turns to the head man at the crash site and says, "Well, Chuck, it looks like you had this thing figured right all along." And, of course, in the nearby secret alien base, the human guard force is mustered out frantically by the head of the UFO cover-up and told to go take back this crash saucer from the ranchers. So they run this several hundred guys in black uniforms. They look like a giant SWAT team in armored personnel carriers, and they send them out from the base up this ridge to try and recapture this saucer from all these heavily armed ranchers. And I'm not going to tell you what happens.
You'll have to buy the book for that one. And
You'll have to buy the book.
Right.
The paperback has the best edit. It's but anyway, back in Washington D.C., the word spreads. They shot down this flying saucer.
Oh, geez.
And one of the humans who had been on board the saucer, they were supposed to just be going to the base, and the alien decides he's going to mutilate this cow. The alien commander of the saucer and the head of the chief officer on board this human on board this flying saucer, he says, "We don't have any time for this crap. Let's go to the base. We don't have any time for this nonsense." And of course, he's the alien just hisses at him.
It sounds like a screenplay, and it sounds awesome. And that is on Amazon.com, right? That's on
Amazon.com. And then, and then when the cover-up collapses, the president goes on national TV and announces he's declaring a state of emergency. And one of the things he says in his speech is that he almost jokes. He says, "My fellow Americans, I must say, no, Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore." He said, "The truth is that Kansas was always stuck right in the middle of Oz, a little island of the familiar in a sea of strangeness."
Very good.
And he says, "So we're not in Kansas anymore."
Indeed, we're not. I was going to interrupt you for just a microsecond to switch.
Sure.
We're going to go for a 3-minute break, and we'll be right back, everybody. Stay tuned with Dr. John Brandenburg. Welcome to Mars. What a wonderful piece of music. Thank you, Keith Rowland, for that. And of course,
that was great.
Isn't it? Awesome. Yeah, welcome back, everybody, to Hyperspace, of course, on Dark Matter Radio Network, and my special guest, Dr. John Brandenburg. Such a pleasure to have you on tonight, Doctor. It's been incredible.
This is really nice, and I thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and didn't mean to cut you off when you were talking about your book there. I just want to take a miniature break.
That's all right.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating, and it almost parallels a lot of truth, would you say? Do you think there's a little bit of truth in your science fiction?
Well, I did the best educated guesswork I could, and I read everything up on ufology I could. Mm-hmm. I even talked to abductees, people, I remember talking to this one, very lovely, and she was, she had glorious long black hair. She was very pale. And she she said, this has destroyed my life, finding out, that I'm being abducted by aliens. And like she belonged to a fundamentalist church, and they had basically kicked her out of the church, claiming she was demon-possessed. And so she had, I think she was going to an Episcopalian church like me then. And so Episcopalians were very accepting. So and she said, this has really devastated my life. And I said, well, you look very well. And she says, well, my hair, it's actually white. It's turned white. She says, I dye it black. So it'll look like it did before, but it's actually white now. And so I tried to capture that kind of horror in the book and sense of human helplessness in the face of, cosmological realities and evil. And I tried to also make it a good story. I have it has two heroines. They're both news. They're news anchors on this kind of CNN-like show, and imagine Robin Meade and somebody else on CNN suddenly getting all this classified documents from the government, someone in the government leaking them to them, and rather than just ignoring them, they decide to investigate. And pretty soon, people are trying to kill them.
Or for the course, right?
At first, the heads of the UFO cover-up treat this as an internal problem because they realize somebody in their organization is leaking stuff. So they're more concerned with finding out who it is in their organization. And the head of the UFO cover-up is this one very pompous character, and he says, nobody's going to listen to those two bimbos. 6 months later, he's dead. And his entire organization is destroyed. And so, because they succeed, they bring down the UFO cover-up.
Sure.
It dies a horrid, violent, bloody death in this novel. And
nice outlet.
Well, you have a president declaring a state of emergency and trying to declare Congress in recess. Mm-hmm. He said, well, the Constitution is one thing, and survival is another, he says. We have no time for constitutional niceties here. And,
well, sounds like a parallel with what's happening now. I do have a quick question for you, not to go
sure.
backwards, but now I'm familiar with the Black Space Program. Obviously you've heard stories about the Black Space Program. Do you think it's a possibility that they've deployed their own teams out there and have actually nuked certain areas to sort of just get rid of the ancient artifacts or anything there that might be a remnant of an advanced civilization? Any chance of that?
We see no evidence.
Okay.
The same stuff that was there in 1976 is still there. We just have better pictures of it now. Mm-hmm. So, like I said, if anything, the U.S. government has been aiding and abetting this investigation by providing enormous amounts of data and just dumping it for us to sort through. And if they have their own investigation of this, I think they have a parallel investigation, and they basically just copy everything we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Right, it makes it easier for them.
They have a limited budget, and so they just basically follow up on whatever we do, and then we have Malin Space Science Systems is the contractor that runs all the cameras for Jet Propulsion Lab, but not for Arizona State University. So ASU produces these superb pictures, and they're just taking pictures. Mm-hmm. Whereas Malin Space Science Systems, whose acronym is MSSS, is constantly releasing data that is, mishandled, or you could say it's misinformational. Mm-hmm. So they're their own pun. They're their own walking pun.
Right. Well, that's just it. I mean, and also there's so many things that have been airbrushed. It makes one wonder what you can really trust insofar as any type of visual or...
Well, if the government didn't want us to know certain things, we just wouldn't see them.
Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly.
I mean, there occasionally something will leak through, but if there were in my novel, for instance, the UFO cover-up, I shift to scenes on the far side of the moon where there's these big alien bases that are being, the aliens in a crash program are enlarging them,
mm-hmm.
or a planned takeover of the Earth, and they're trying to do this. If you study Sun Tzu, the best way to win a battle or a war is without any fighting at all.
Mm-hmm.
They're hoping in the novel, the aliens are basically figure they've subverted the U.S. government because in the novel, the civilian part of the UFO cover-up has gone native. Mm-hmm. They're basically siding with the aliens now. They've gone from basically trying to gather intelligence on the aliens, in preparation to repel a possible invasion, to now just working with them. Mm-hmm. They've gotten completely. Is
this your book?
This is in the book.
I was going to say, it sounds like what's happening now.
Well, in the book, the heroine, one of the heroines, this beautiful Chinese American woman, is talking to a colonel who's in the cover-up. He's part of the military wing of the UFO cover-up, the Special Forces. They're the people who show up whenever there's a crash saucer. Mm-hmm. To cordon off the area and recover it and capture it if there are any aliens on board, and etc. And they're really kind of in a desperate state because their job is to defend the country, and they sense that the civilian group, the Magi in the novel, this is all in the novel, by the way, the Magi in the novel, kind of the Majestic 12, mm-hmm. are now basically working for the aliens. And so they, and so she, the lead heroine, Cassandra Chen, the joke in the novel, by the way, there's a blonde heroine. They're both news anchors at this news network, kind of like Fox News or CNN. It's called CNS or SINS. They joke it's called SINS because there's so many scandals there and everything. So they, Cassandra asked this colonel, who's actually just saved her life. Somebody was trying to kill her, and they've decided to try and protect the two women. So you have one kind of bunch of gumshoes trying to kill them, and then another bunch of gumshoes trying to save them. Mm-hmm. It just shows that the organization is in complete confusion. And so anyway, so she asks him, they're talking privately, and she asks him, well, would you characterize the UFO cover-up situation as, in a snafu state? He says, oh, we passed out a snafu 10 years ago. He says, let's see, what's the next acronym? The next stage beyond snafu is, it's called, let's see, fouled up. It's FUBAR. FUBAR.
Oh, okay.
A military acronym for, situation normal. I'm speaking charitably because we're on the radio. Situation normal, all fouled up.
Right.
Is that's snafu. But when things get even above, that's the normal situation. But when things get completely messed up, they call that situation FUBAR.
That's funny.
Which is fouled up beyond all recognition.
That sounds like what's going on right now on this planet.
And you could see that going on.
Yeah, it's a mirror image.
The mirror image. The thing that reminded me what happened in my novel is this face down between this rancher and the federal government. And the federal government tucked tail and ran, basically. And, a posse showed up to back him up. Now, I'm not familiar with the legal details of his case, but I know this is classic American justice. If a bunch of people, the federal government tries to throw its weight around, and an armed militia shows up and says, no, you can't do that, not around here. And the government, this is why we have a Second Amendment. And so in the novel, this results in an enormous shootout.
So maybe you're prophetic in some way, huh?
In this case, they cut Interstate 15. And so this government is indulging in overreach. And, as Abraham Lincoln, I don't want to get into the politics of this present situation. That'd be a whole other program. I'll stay focused on off the earth, let's say.
Okay.
But I will just say that this administration, it recalls, the statement of Abraham Lincoln, who said, you can fool some of the people all of the time, and you can fool all the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And so this administration's credibility is kind of coming unraveled around the edges. And I was standing outside watching, the lunar eclipse last night on Passover. And, to our Jewish listeners, shalom, and may God preserve you, the children of Israel. And typically, a lunar eclipse, which turns the moon into a blood color, in fact, it looked just like Mars.
Right.
And right beside it, up to the right, is the planet Mars, looking just so brilliant that it gave you it actually hurt your eyes to look at it.
Right. It's gorgeous.
And so this was I woke up at 2 in the morning. Suddenly I thought, why am I waking up at 2 in the morning? I realized, the eclipse. So I ran outside and took a big look. And I forgot to put any shoes on. So I was standing there barefoot, and it actually snowed, and I didn't even notice. I was so excited because it was such a awesome sight to see the planet Mars and then this blood-red moon, and realize that I'm a scientist. I like to have everything quantified and everything, but let me tell you something about me as a scientist. I know I don't know everything. And I'm religious. I'm a Christian. I believe in the supernatural. And so seeing this great sight and realizing it's Passover, there's a fundamentalist pastor named Hagee who would probably get in a brawl with me if I talked about extraterrestrial life. But one thing we do agree on is that every time there's been it's a historical fact that every time there's been a lunar eclipse like this on Passover, which is according to the Jewish calendar, which runs a lunar cycle, the first night of Passover is supposed to be the full moon. So there's a eclipse on that. The last time there were three previous times this has happened. One was in 1492, and it was just before Ferdinand and Isabella, the kings and queen of Spain, expelled all the Jewish people from Spain. So that was a disaster for the Jewish people. But they all went to Europe, so Europe benefited. And but also they discovered America just shortly after this edict of eviction. So that happened. So this was a momentous thing in the Jewish world and also the world as a whole, followed right after this eclipse on the Passover. Then the next time it happened was in 1948, just before Israel declared its independence, and there was the War of Israeli Independence, where Israel is a nation which had disappeared entirely from history and been scattered to the four winds, suddenly reassembles itself in its old place. And I discuss this, by the way, in the book Cosmic Jesus, as one of the most remarkable events in modern times. And so that happened just before the Israeli War of Independence, and then the most recent time it had happened was just before the Six-Day War, when we almost went to war with the Soviet Union over a war in the Middle East. Almost became a world war, and Jerusalem was seized by Israel, and they conquered Jerusalem and got control of the Temple Mount. By the way, even a cursory reading of biblical prophecy shows that the Temple of Solomon is going to be rebuilt on that spot. And I don't want to be standing around there when that happens.
Not a good idea.
One thing I discovered from studying history, one of the questions in my book Cosmic Jesus was, is the God of history the same as the God of the Bible? And I concluded yes. In other words, is there some seemingly irresistible force trying to accomplish certain things in history, like destroying Israel as a nation, scattering it to the four winds, and then suddenly reassembling it back in its same place? It's the second time that has happened. Even the origins of Israel was Abraham. He's a Babylonian, basically, a Babylonian shepherd. He picks up his family and his beautiful wife and is told by God to go journey. He basically journeys to Haran, up at the north of this Tigris-Euphrates Valley, and then follows the Fertile Crescent through Syria, then through Armageddon, and down into Israel. And he, God tells him, I'm going to show you a place and I want you to claim it. I'm going to make you a great nation there. God leads Abraham in the Bible to the land of Canaan. This just happens to be the land bridge between Africa and Eurasia, the two most populous continents on Earth. All trade between Egypt and all of the rest of Africa and the rest of the world had to pass through Israel. So that was the most strategic place possible. And Abraham doesn't have a globe, he doesn't have maps, he doesn't have a GPS system, and yet he is told to found a nation there, which he does. And then the Babylonians, Israel was caught historically in a great power struggle between Egypt, which was one of the superpowers of the ancient times, and Babylon, which was, so you've got Egypt on the Nile, and then you've got Babylon on the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, Mesopotamia, and Israel is caught between the hammer and the anvil. And Israel is destroyed because it had traditionally been an ally of Egypt. Everything that Israel learned, it was learned in Egypt when it was captive there. So the Egyptians and Israel traditionally were kind of allies. And so the Babylonians didn't want an ally of Egypt on that land bridge, so they just rounded up everybody in the countryside and drove them all to Mesopotamia, where they could have easily just disappeared as a people, just been absorbed like the Hittites and there are other great empires that just completely disappeared. Their people just completely absorbed into other tribes. But Israel is not any other people. So the Persians conquer the Babylonians, and the Persians, the king of Persia, decides that the Temple of Solomon must be rebuilt. So he rounds up as many Israelis who want to volunteer to go back to their old land, rebuild the temple, rebuild Jerusalem, and have a country again. And so after being captive in Tigris-Euphrates Valley for about, I think it was 300 years, something like this, they are suddenly back in their own country again, on the land bridge between Africa and Eurasia, thriving again. So the nation disappears completely, could have easily just disappeared, doesn't. It's reborn. Then, it had this precarious existence caught between the empires in Egypt and the empires in the rest of Eurasia. Then this guy named Julius Caesar has an affair with a queen of Egypt named Cleopatra. This is how the story begins again. And Israel gets conquered by the Romans. It's part of the Roman Empire, and the person the Romans put in charge, he becomes a favorite of Caesar because Herod Antipas led a bunch of troops to help Julius Caesar in this one battle. He led a bunch of troops from Israel, Jewish troops, to help Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar is very grateful and makes King Herod king. Here's the Roman Empire. And one corner of it, they decide to leave a king in place, Herod. And so this is the situation that's all set up for Jesus to be born. And Jesus is born in Nazareth, which is near Galilee, the Sea of Galilee. Turns out that Galilee was the western terminus of the Silk Road. Silk had the trade between China, India, and the Roman Empire had begun. You had silk from China arriving in Rome. And the reason we know this is because just about the time Jesus was born, the Roman social commentators began complaining bitterly that these Italian women are wearing silk, which is transparent. And they are walking down the street clothed seemingly in light and nothing else. And so the Roman commentators, who were kind of traditional family men, said that this is a disaster. Means the empire is going to be overthrown. It's all about the silk.
That's right.
The silk comes right through Galilee to the Mediterranean, because Galilee is across the plain of Armageddon. It turns out the the town of Nazareth, where Jesus grew up, overlooks the plain of Armageddon, where all these battles were fought. To show you Israel's strategic position, to the north of Israel is Tyre and Sidon, the chief cities of the Phoenicians. One of the other cities is called Biblios, where we get the word Bible from book. Bible, just in ancient language, just means the book. The Phoenicians spread civilization north to Greece, and in particular, they spread Egyptian learning from Egypt, geometry, mathematics, science, astronomy, from Egypt up to Greece. And it all goes through Israel in ancient times. And so the Valley of Armageddon is a place where the road goes from Galilee to the coast, it splits and goes south to Egypt along the coast road, through then Sinai and Suez to Egypt. It goes north to Tyre and Sidon, the cities of the Phoenicians, and of course then Greece, and of course the ports on the Mediterranean where everything can go to Rome. And one of the other places the Silk Road split at a place called Haran, the ancient city of Haran, and it went north to Tarsus, where Paul grew up. So the Bible is the result of the Silk Road, which was the internet of ancient times. And I point out in the book that one of the things that was sent of trade, goods of trade in the ancient times, was not just silk or spices, things that could be carried along on a camel over deserts for a long distance without spoiling, or they had to be light. But the lightest most valuable good of all was learning. Mm-hmm. People in ancient times were just as eager to learn about new things as they are now. And when Paul shows up in Athens, there's a whole school of philosophers, and he's preaching, the gospel. He's preaching Christianity, and it's the only place in the Bible where the planet Mars is mentioned. Is that these philosophers say to Paul, "Hey, why don't you come give a lecture at our big, lecture hall, which happens to be at a place called Mars Hill." And Paul gets invited to it's like, somebody visiting the United States with some new philosopher and being invited to Harvard University to give a lecture. So they invite him to Mars Hill, the Hill of the Philosophers, to give a lecture on Christianity, and he does. And it's a very, you can tell from that he is thoroughly educated in Greek philosophy, because he's a philosopher explaining Christianity in philosophic terms to a bunch of other philosophers. Mm-hmm. But what it shows in those days was that people looked on learning, and if you came down the Silk Road with a load of silk and said, "Oh, also, I can teach you of the great learning of the great master Confucius," people would invite you to give a lecture. Local philosophers would all get together, their families and friends, and then they'd listen to you talk about the teachings of Confucius or Buddha. So there's a idea. It's very natural, by the way, because so much of Jesus' childhood was not discussed. Mm-hmm. Jesus grew up in one of the most cosmopolitan places on earth, which was Galilee. And when you, even though Nazareth was a backward little village, Jesus was not a farmer. He didn't come from a farming family. He also did not come from a family of merchants, which he would have joined caravans to China and India, and perhaps learned of Buddhist teachings and the teachings of Confucius and everything that way. No, actually, he didn't need to do that at all. All he needed to do was stay at the shores of the Sea of Galilee. His father, Joseph, was a carpenter, and that meant he had to go get work in the prosperous cities around the Sea of Galilee. That's what he would have done, because there's very little work for a carpenter in Nazareth. There's no money there. If you want somebody who's going to put in new cabinets in their kitchen or put up a new stable, it's got to be in Capernaum or some of these other towns that line the Sea of Galilee. And that's, in fact, where they find where Jesus emerges as an adult, is in Capernaum, which is right on the Sea of Galilee. It's a prosperous, mostly Jewish town, but it's also, there are a lot of Roman and Greek people who live in that area who are very interested in philosophy. And so it is very natural to assume that Jesus was exposed to the teachings of Confucius and Buddhism, mm-hmm. things like this, because when Jesus, if you analyze what Jesus talks about in his teaching, which electrified one of the reasons it electrified the land of Israel, and he got all these large crowds following him, was because so much of what he taught was a mixture of traditional Judaism and all of this new kind of Greek philosophy, mm-hmm. and even Eastern philosophy, like the principle of, do not resist those who do evil against you, turn the other cheek. That is from Lao Tzu in China. Mm-hmm. And the idea that the golden rule, do unto others as you have them do unto you, that actually has its origination in Confucius. Confucius, the great master, was asked one day by one of his disciples to summarize all of his teachings in one word. And he responded and said, yes, that one word is reciprocity. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So the golden rule actually appears to originate with Confucius. It ended up in Galilee and is adopted by Jesus. The idea of death of self, the idea of taking up your cross, and he tells his disciples, take up your cross and follow me, meaning give up your life. That's Buddhist. The annihilation of self. That myself, I'm factoring myself out of, and my fate out of this equation. I'm just going to do what God wants me to do. And so and when people like his disciples, well, actually, what's funny is if you read the Gospels, I'm constantly rereading them. They're very interesting. It's nothing is more apparent than the disciples barely understood what Jesus was saying most of the time. They go to a village and come back from the village, and Jesus is standing there. And when they come back, he says, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees," And they start arguing amongst themselves. See, I told you we should have bought some bread. Because they think he's talking about bread. And he says, no. I'm saying beware of the teaching of the Pharisee. Jesus spoke of teaching as a leaven, like yeast that feeds on itself. And so the disciples don't know what he's talking about most of the time. They're a bunch of fishermen. In fact, Jesus' apparently, well, when he argues, like when people ask him, should we pay taxes to Caesar? Which is a really tricky question because in Israel, paying taxes had a religious significance. And so the Romans, by the way, had to keep... The Middle East was tense back in those days, just like it is now, because the Roman Empire had to garrison Israel very heavily to protect against another empire called the Parthians that were about 300 miles to the east. And the Parthians were very powerful. They had defeated Roman armies in the field. And at one point, the Parthians had pushed the Romans all the way out of Asia Minor and into Greece. And they took Jerusalem, and then King Herod, in fact, took it back for the Romans. So the Romans kept that area of Israel very heavily garrisoned with troops, especially also in Syria. And even in those days, the difference between Middle Eastern societies and European society was dramatic, particularly their attitude toward women. So you can imagine, here's Israel, a kind of Middle Eastern country in those days, and they have large numbers of young, healthy Italian men stationed there. So, behaving as young Italian men. So there's all sorts of friction all the time, and they're constantly taxing the population to support all these troops. And they asked Jesus, is it okay to pay taxes to Caesar, to the Romans? And Jesus responds using the Socratic method, Greek philosophy. He responds to their question with a question. He says, show me one of the coins. Whose face is it on there? He knows darn well whose face is on the coin, but he wants them to say it. And this is the Socratic method. And then, they say, well, it's Caesar's face. And he says, well, renders to Caesar what's Caesar's. To God, what's God's. And, the other thing is, in those days, the regulations for what was kosher were so strict. I mean, you had to wash your hands make yourself ritually clean. You had to wash your hands 7 times before eating. And most of the poor people, shepherds and farmers and stuff, they didn't have that much water. So they'd maybe wash their hands once, if at all, before eating something. And the disciples at one point they find a field of wheat, and in those days, you were supposed to leave some of the wheat beside the road so that travelers could snack on it. Mm-hmm. So the disciples are rubbing the ears of wheat with their hands and then eating the raw kernels of wheat. And the Pharisees, this very strict sect of Israel's religion, sees this and say to him, don't you care? Your disciples are eating stuff without washing their hands first. And Jesus says, it's what comes out of a man that makes him unclean, not what he eats. Mm-hmm. And that is Greek philosophy. Mm-hmm. And Greek common sense, meaning that it's a person's character that makes him clean or unclean before God, not how many times he washes his hands. Mm-hmm. But to people in Israel so used to the law, and this was just an astonishing idea, and very liberating, because suddenly, oh, you mean we don't have to wash our hands 7 times? Mm-hmm. God will still love us even if we don't. And so Jesus is preaching this amazing mixture of Eastern learning, Greek philosophy, and traditional Judaism. He obviously knows the scriptures back and forth, even though he's not trained. So what it looks like is though some rich family in Capernaum took Jesus under their wing and had him given a kind of Greek education. Mm-hmm. And you can see that because, like, he's living in Capernaum. He doesn't have a job. Somebody is supporting him. Apparently, Jesus attracted the attention of, enlightened, very educated, wealthy people who kind of figured that they liked him. Mm-hmm. And they basically, so he had rich patrons, apparently. And this is nowhere better illustrated when he was crucified. Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man, says, I want his body so I can give it a proper burial. And they bury him in a rich man's tomb. Mm-hmm. A new tomb carved out of solid rock. That was pricey in those days. Oh, another example, he takes the Passover in Jerusalem with his 12 disciples. Mm-hmm. That is no small affair. Somebody had to pay for that. Somebody did. Mm-hmm. So everywhere Jesus went, he apparently had a group of well-meaning and rather wealthy people. And you think, why would anyone do that? Well, part of the reason was the worst nightmare for any intelligent person in Israel was that there would be a revolt against the Romans that would be hopeless. Mm-hmm. Because they knew the common people who didn't know anything about the Roman Empire. They just knew there's a bunch of young Italian men stationed in our country, ogling our women when they come marching by, in their armor. And what's worse is some of the women probably ogled them back, etc. It's causing, they're foreigners. The common people that, God will give us a miraculous victory over the Romans. Mm-hmm. And anyone who knew anything about the Roman Empire knew that the Roman Empire was more powerful than any other empire they'd ever dealt with. The Persians, the Greeks, the Greco-Macedonian Empire of Alexander the Great, they had actually successfully revolted against the Greeks at one point. And so the Zealots, also called the Sicarii, because they carried daggers, they were, was kind of the Israeli Liberation Front. And they wanted to have a revolt against the Romans, and they felt that God would help them. And anyone with any brains in Israel who knew anything about the Roman Empire, who had traveled around the Roman Empire, knew the Roman Empire was so powerful. Mm-hmm. that they would be crushed like ants. And in fact, that's just exactly what happened 30 years after Jesus departed the scene, and his death and resurrection. And so 30 years after Jesus was crucified and then, resurrected and ascended into heaven, the Jewish people did revolt against the Romans under Nero, as it turns out, and they were annihilated. In fact, the state of Israel ceased to exist after that. It was scattered to the four winds. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the Romans they destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, and they even renamed the place. It had been named the province of Judea, and they renamed it Palestinia, which means Philistine. They even wanted to erase the name of Israel. So people were so afraid that was going to happen in Jesus' time since Jesus taught peace. He also said, and this would have been especially important to the Romans, that pay your taxes. It's tax day, by the way.
Yeah.
I filed mine. Thank God. Hey, I consider paying my taxes to be part of my duty as a citizen. And, I love this country, and I think it does a pretty good job. There's a saying by Richard Nixon, who had his faults but was a really smart guy. He said, "There's nothing wrong with this country that can't be cured by a good election." So we're going to have one. Mm-hmm. In any case, when Jesus is arrested by the temple authorities and brought to Pontius Pilate's first reaction, the Romans had very good intelligence services in those days. They would have followed Jesus around and copied down everything he said. They want to know if this guy's going to be a problem. In fact, I always imagine Pontius Pilate as Peter De Niro.
Mm-hmm. I mean Robert De Niro, or
Robert De Niro, and let's see, and his right hand man is Joe Pesci. Peter, the Pilate, the De Niro character walks in, he sees Jesus, he says, "What's he doing here? Let him go." Mm-hmm. We don't want any trouble with him, because he's keeping things calm. Mm-hmm. The Romans, he marches, he comes into Jerusalem riding on a donkey, a young donkey, very humble. And the Romans don't do anything, because they have already satisfied themselves that he was a teacher of peace, and that he was actually discouraging people from having a revolt against the Romans. So the Romans were actually quite happy with Jesus. It was Jesus' disruption of the mercantile ism in the temple that probably caused the most problems, and that got his death sentence signed. So anyway, so Jesus is welcomed by cheering crowds on Palm Sunday, and then by Good Friday, he's crucified with a jeering mob watching. Mm-hmm. So shows how people in ancient times are no different than the present. Mm-hmm. You can go from being an idol to a pariah overnight.
Yep. Yeah, angry mobs can be dangerous.
Oh, absolutely. There's such a thing as mob mentality, and so they. I tried to study all of this stuff as carefully as possible. The really fascinating thing is Jesus was followed everywhere by informers who were reporting. I mean, every government in the area was keeping track of Jesus, because the Romans want to make sure he doesn't lead a revolt. The Romans decide, no, he's not that sort of person. He's keeping everyone calm, telling them to pay their taxes. And did I mention that he tells people to pay their taxes, which makes the Romans really happy. So Jesus is not giving any heartburn to the Romans at all. To the local religious authorities, though, he's a big challenge to them. And because people are saying he's the Messiah. And so they are upset with him, and then he, of course, overturns all of the money-changing tables in the temple, and drives out all the animals and everything. A violent act, and says that they made the temple a den of thieves, and so they're the people who are really mad at him, but. Everywhere he goes, he's being followed by informers. In fact, Judas Iscariot. By the way, the one interpretation of Judas Iscariot is that he is a Sicarii, a dagger man, one of the groups of what's called the Zealots who wanted to start a revolt to overthrow Romans. In fact, there's another disciple known as Simon the Zealot. But Judas would have been of even the radical wing of the Zealots, called the Sicarii, who are actually running around knifing people, and a Sicarii, Iscariot. So everywhere Jesus goes, he's followed by informers. Apparently, the Jewish Sanhedrin knows that he has prophesied that he will die and then be resurrected on the third day. So he dies on the cross, and the Romans make sure that nobody comes off the cross alive. That's why they jabbed him with a spear. He's taken down. He's put in this new tomb, and the Sanhedrin comes to Pilate and says, we want a temple guard. We want a Roman guard on the tomb. Now, they could have used the temple guard. They had their own kind of police soldiers that guarded the temple and maintained order there, especially because no one who was non-Jewish could enter the inner part of the temple. The Roman soldiers couldn't go there. Mm-hmm. So they had their own paramilitary. They could have used their own paramilitary to guard the tomb, but no, they wanted the Romans because the Romans are far more intimidating. Because they said the disciples are going to come steal his body. So they rolled a big stone over the tomb and sealed it, with a wax seal or something like this, and they had a Roman guard there. A Roman guard detachment was supposed to guard its position unto death. If you were a squad of Roman soldiers, you could never retreat from where you were told. You were supposed to die there.
Okay, and on that note, Dr. Brandenburg, I just want to let you know we have about 4 minutes left of the show. So. Oh,
I'm terribly sorry.
I appreciate you. I'm enjoying what you're saying. I just want to make sure we're on time here. But I do want to let go ahead.
Yeah. Just to summarize, the mystery is where were the Roman guards? They are gone when Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb and the stone is rolled away. So all the rest of the disciples were ready to go back to Galilee and resume their fishing career. Mm-hmm. With no resurrection, there would have been no church. And anyway, so I discussed this in the book, how anomalous this is in history. Mm-hmm. But anyway, you wanted to say something.
Well, actually, I just want to promote your book, Cosmic Jesus, The Metaphysics of How the God of Israel Became the God of the Cosmos. And that's available on Amazon.com. I do want to thank you very much for being here tonight. And
Solaris, it's been really wonderful being on your show.
It's been wonderful to have you on, and I hope to have you come back so we can talk more about all this.
My next book on Mars.
That's right. You better. Well, I have more questions on Mars, by the way. We kind of got sidetracked a little bit, but yeah, there's so much information there. And I do want to thank everybody for listening. I hope you all enjoyed this incredible interview. And also, is there anything you'd like to wrap up with? I know I kind of cut you off at the end of that.
No, that's, I guess, my conclusion is the God of history, the God of physics, is the same as the God of the Bible. Mm-hmm. I mean, everybody, Israel, Jesus, apparently is who they claim they would be, because they've affected history to that degree. And that was my conclusion in the book. Mm-hmm. So, but everybody's free to draw their own conclusions.
And right, it's also about the cosmic Christ too. I mean,
that's right. The appearance of Jesus on Earth was apparently a cosmic event, it's not limited to Earth at all. Mm-hmm. So the Bible is already there in the cosmos. There is no box. People say, "Oh, you got to quit thinking in the box." there is no box. There's the stars.
Absolutely.
And there's the earth and the stars, and God is already there.
Right.
He sees everything.
I agree. With that being said, would you say that Christ was a star being?
I would say that he was from outside the cosmos, and the cosmos needed him, the whole cosmos. And what we're finding on Mars indicates we live in a dark, fallen cosmos, unfortunately, where things, as they say in my novel about the UFO cover-up, the heroine says, finally she concludes that the rest of the universe is just as screwed up as this planet is, maybe even more.
Oh no, that's nothing I want to hear.
I know. She then says, she's talking about her and the blonde. She says, imagine our disappointment when we found this out.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, we need something to be hopeful about, right?
Right. Well, in the face of cosmological evil, you have a cosmic Jesus standing at your side.
That's beautiful. And with that being said, I hope everybody has a nice Easter who celebrate. Of course, I think. Yeah, it's coming right around the corner, and once again, we've got about 30 seconds left here, but I do want to
celebrate the empty tomb with no Roman guard detachment. They've somehow disappeared.
That's interesting.
They have a lot of explaining to do. In fact, I speculate in the book that the last person to find out that things didn't go smoothly at the tomb was Pontius Pilate, because bad news travels very slowly.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, somebody's head would have rolled on that one, right?
Right.
Pun intended, though. But
yes, that's right. So. It's it's a fascinating mystery.
It is, and thank you so much, Doctor. Everybody have a great week.
Happy Easter.
Happy Easter.